Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: chess books should be used as we use glasses to assist sight, although some players make use of them as if they thought they conferred sight. From Jose Raul Capablanca. In the last part, we started the last chapter of the book, chapter 6, Maneuvering Against Weaknesses, part 2 of the book, Position Play, and discuss the topics: the need for maneuvering and the terrain, the maneuvering pivot, with illustrations from Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further in the chapter, Nimzowitsch discusses the next topic, number 3, combined play on both wings, with weaknesses which, though for the moment wanting, are yet latent or hidden. Nimzowitsch writes, Von Gottschall versus Nemsevich, Hanover, 1926. See the position on board. A logical analysis of the position reveals the following data. White's pawn at c5 is, in the view of the insecure position of the bishop at f2, to be regarded as a pawn weakness. On the other hand, I cannot agree under any circumstances in branding the pawn mass g3, h3 as a weakness, and this for the reason that here on the king's wing, terrain is lacking. Black chose the following maneuver, which at first sight looks a most unintelligible one. King e5, rook b4, and king d5. The explanation of this combination, which sacrifices a tempo, lies in the following. With these moves, a position is reached where white is in a zugzwang. For if the rook goes back to b6 and the rook has no other plausible move, for rook d4 check fails against king takes on c5, rook takes on e4 discovered check, question mark, rook takes on f2 check, and so on. While, as we shall see, h4 would provide just that terrain which before was so sadly missed. If the rook goes back to b6, there will follow after the breakthrough h4. G takes on h4, G takes on h4, bishop takes on h4, the intermezzo, king takes on c5, threatening the rook. So white decided after all on h4. There followed g takes on h4, g takes on h4, rook h3, rook d4 check, king e6, rook d8, bishop d5, and now black begins systematically to maneuver against the pawn at h4, with the point g4 as his pivot, and in fact, by the way of this point, succeeded in breaking into his opponent's game. The meaning of the strategy employed here appears out of the following scheme, which is applicable to all analogous or comparable cases. We maneuvered first against the obvious weakness, the pawn at c5, by means of the zugzwang with a slight mixture of threats. We succeeded in inducing our opponent to make a deployment h4. This, however, only led to a weakness, which before h4 was merely latent or hidden, becoming patent or obvious, and moreover easily assailable. To recapitulate, play on two wings is usually based on the following idea. We engage one wing, or the obvious weakness in it, and thus draw the other enemy wing out of its reserve, when new weakness will be created on the reserve wing. And so the signal is given for systematic maneuvering against two weaknesses. As in the game Kalashnikov versus Nimzowitsch we gave previously in this chapter, this is the rule. As an interesting exception to the rule, I may call attention to the case where we may act as if the exposure of the weakness on the other wing had already taken place. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram as follows. combined attack on both wings. The white weaknesses are the pawn at c5 and, as becomes evident later, the pawn at h3. Nimzowitsch continues, the following is an example of such an exposure. 1. Halsen versus Nimzowitsch, Hanover 1926. See the position on board. Black here hastened to bring about the exposure and moved rook h6. True, the real fight was to take place on the queen's wing, but I knew that after I had succeeded in opening up the game by b5 and so on, the advanced position of white's kingside pawns could only serve my ends. There followed h3, rook g6, rook e2, a6, rook f4, b5, b3, rook g5, g4, rook e5, king c3 and a5. The weakness h3 in conjunction with the possible chance of getting the pawn at e4 unblocked made black peremptory or immediately focused in his demand for terrain with a pivot to go with it. It is for this that black was fighting with his last moves. Rook f2 and a4. Now a takes on b3 is threatened, followed by b takes on c4, allowing an invasion by the rooks via the a and b files. B takes on a4, b takes on c4, rook f8, rook e7, rook takes on e8, rook takes on e8, knight takes on c4, knight takes on c4, king takes on c4 and rook a8. The desired terrain is now 1. It consists of the a, b and d files. I should call d4 the pivot. Rook f7 or king b3 question mark, king d5. So rook f7, rook takes on a4 check and king b3. King c3 was rather better. So king b3, rook b4 check, king c3, rook b7, rook f5, rook a7, king c4, rook a4 check, king b3 and rook d4, the pivot. Rook e5, king d6, rook e8, rook d3 check, king c4 and rook takes on h3. The proper use made of the terrain has not failed to yield fruit. The weakness has fallen. Rook takes on e4, rook a3, rook e2, rook a4 check, king b5, rook takes on g4, a4, rook b4 check and black won on the 71st move. In the position on board, Teichmann versus Nimzowitsch, San Sebastian 1911, an elegant mating threat is used merely as an instrument to carry out with gain of tempo a weakening attack on the enemy's queen's wing. Knight e6, threatening rook takes on h2 check, knight takes on h2, rook takes on h2 check, king takes on h2, queen f2 check, king h3, bishop f4 and wins. Rook e2 parries the threat, but now there follows with gain of tempo knight d4. The game went on rook e1. If rook f2, bishop e3. So rook e1 and queen b7. Rook c8 cannot be warded off now except by a sacrifice. Rook takes on d4 or c3 question mark. B takes on c3, b takes on c3, queen b2 check and wins. So rook takes on d4, e takes on d4 and black won after a hard struggle. See game number 40. Please note that we shall cover this game in its entirety towards the end of the video series along with remaining games from the illustrative games section of the book. Nimzowitsch continues. We will now give two end games which illustrate in miniature the combined attack on two wings. As the position on board, Westergaard versus Nimzowitsch from a simultaneous display against 25 opponents shows Black Nimzowitsch has first made a gesture as if he were going to attack the Queen's wing, but then has chosen the King's wing for his field of operations. White has taken up a tough defensive position. It was my move, and after a little reflection, I played b5, double exclamation mark. Great astonishment among the spectators. On the Queen's wing, Black has surely no troops for the attack. However, the sequel was c takes on b5, rook h2. Knight takes on h2, rook takes on h2, bishop f1, and bishop takes on b5. Now we have daylight. The advance on the Queen's wing was conceived as a diversion against the King's wing. Bishop takes on b5, knight h3, check, king f1, queen takes on e3, queen e1, queen g1 check, king e2, queen takes on g2 check, and mate in two moves. The next example also, consider the position on board, is characteristic of a surprising cooperation of two separate diversions. It is taken from a game played in a tournament of the lighter genre in Leipzig, Germany, 1926. The game proceeded h4, knight takes on g3, h takes on g3, rook d2, and now there followed a thrust on the other wing, a5. My opponent parried with b5, but after bishop takes on h3, g takes on h3, queen takes on h3 check, king g1, and d5 double exclamation mark. The point, he resigned since the effect of the check at c5 is catastrophic. His correct move was bishop f1 instead of b5. For example, a takes on b4, rook b2, and c5 with a drawish position. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram as follows. Seifert versus Nimzowitsch. Black's kingside attack will get unexpected support. Nimzowitsch continues. For further games illustrating this chapter, see games number 40 to 45. Please note that of these recommended games, games number 41 was covered in part 46 of this video series, whereas the rest will be covered towards the end of the video series along with other remaining games from the illustrative games section of the book. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses the next topic, number 4, maneuvering under difficult conditions, our own center lacking protection. Nimzowitsch writes, in conclusion, we will give a game inspired by the true spirit of this form of maneuvering. Consider the position on board. Lasker versus Salve, 1909. Black's cramped king's position is here a glaring weakness, and as such must black's pawn at d6 be regarded. But his own weakness at e4 forces a certain reserve on white. The terrain bearing on the weak pawn at d6 has little elasticity. This pawn can only be attacked by the rook at d1 and from the diagonal. Somewhat more varied seem the possibilities of an advance on the king's wing, for the queen and rook can at any time change places on the g and h files. To make these not precisely impressive possibilities the basis of an effective operation demands the highest skill of a master. Lasker displayed it as follows in his game against Salve. In the position on board, the game continued. Queen e8 and queen f2. If knight f4, the parry knight h6 would be possible. So queen f2, rook f8 and queen d2 watches the pawn at d6 and hence makes the parry just alluded or referred to, that is knight h6 impossible. Queen b8, king h1, rook e8, rook g4 and rook g8. If knight h6, then knight takes on f6 with advantage to white. So rook g8 and rook d1, because the pressure was taken off the e pawn. Queen b4. With this, the queen eventually gets out of play. Queen e8 was decidedly preferable, but it was at this moment difficult to foresee that the circle of influence of the queen entering the enemy game would be so convincingly localized or restricted. So queen b4, queen f2, queen c3 and queen h4. Now this old position taken up anew is stronger than ever. Knight h6, rook f4, knight f7, king h2, rook e8, queen g3, rook g8, rook h4 and g5. The threat was knight f4, knight h6 and rook takes on d6. So g5, f takes on g6 en passant, rook takes on g6, queen f2 and f5 to be rid of the weakness at f6. Knight f4, rook f6, knight e2, queen b2, rook d2, queen a1, knight g3 and king g8. White threatened, e takes on f5, bishop takes on f5, knight takes on f5, rook takes on f5 and rook takes on h7 check. So king g8, e takes on f5, bishop takes on f5, knight d4, c takes on d4, knight takes on f5, king f8, queen takes on d4, queen takes on d4, knight takes on d4, rook f2, rook d8, apologies, knight takes on d4, apologies, knight e5, rook h5, rook f7, c5, d takes on c5, rook takes on e5, c takes on d4, rook takes on d4, rook f2, rook d8 check, king g7, rook a5, and white won. The way in which Lasker conducts the game is impressive. How he manages, in spite of the small variety of threats at his disposal, to dominate the whole board and almost wholly to eliminate his own weakness is worthy of all admiration. The student may learn from this game that the presence of a variety of objects for attack, that is, enemy weaknesses, can up to a certain point compensate for a lack of variety in threat-bearing lines of play. With this magnificent example of master play, we take leave of our readers. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here. This also concludes the current chapter and with it the second part of the book, Position Play. However, before we can congratulate ourselves on completing the book, we still have 23 games left to go through from the third part of the book, Illustrative Games. This we shall commence doing so from the next part. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. I am glad to see 11 new supporters: Smirnster, Inkasinato, restingforest, rawmeatsamwich, Echo Strike 36, DrewPeanutZach, smuice, illustriousbird, Make PogChamp Great Again, sjkanteriii, and amariavevo. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.